The fluorescent lights of the pristine properties management office hummed with a sterile indifference. A sound Caleb Morgan had come to associate with the slow, grinding machinery of manufactured trouble. He sat across a faux mahogany conference table from Brenda, the portfolio manager for Lakeview Meadows. She was the gatekeeper, a woman whose professional pleasantness was as impenetrable as the soundproof glass separating them from the rest of the world. So, to reiterate, Mr. Morgan, Brenda said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. The association is providing you with the requested documents pursuant to state statute. However, as you can see, certain sections have been redacted to protect attorney-client privilege. She slid a thin stack of papers across the table. Caleb picked them up. They were copies of the HOA Board of Directors, meeting minutes from 1988, the year the infamous Article the 8. Section 8.4.2 was adopted. He had requested them a week ago. The first step in his methodical defense against a violation notice that was, at its core, a declaration of war. The pages were a sea of white, punctuated by islands of meaningless text. The entire discussion, deliberation, and rationale for the rule at the heart of his dispute had been obliterated by a thick black marker. Attorney-client privilege, Caleb asked. His voice even. He had learned from his grandfather, a man who navigated disputes with the calm patience of a river carving stone, that the moment you raised your voice was the moment you started losing. Brenda. This was a public board meeting adopting a community-wide covenant. Who was the client? Brenda's smile flickered for a nanosecond. The association. Of course, the board was acting on legal advice to draft the covenants. So the client is the community of homeowners, Caleb countered, leaning forward slightly. As a member of that community, I believe I have a right to understand the original intent of the rules that govern my property. Hiding the entire discussion seems counterproductive to community harmony. Wouldn't you agree? He used their own language against them. Community harmony. It was the cudgel they used to justify everything from forcing an old woman to repaint her front door to, in his case, attempting a brazen land grab. Brenda's mask of politeness was expertly reapplied. The association's legal counsel has advised us this is standard procedure. If you have a further dispute, you may address it at your hearing. She tapped a file folder on her desk, which, I see, has been scheduled for August 5th. Caleb stood, tucking the useless, redacted papers into his briefcase. He knew this was a dead end. Brenda wasn't the source of the problem. She was merely a component of the machine. A well-oiled cog, whose function was to present a polite, procedural barrier between homeowners and the truth. The machine itself was operated by Karen Lawson. Thank you for your time, Brenda, he said, his tone betraying no frustration. He had what he needed: confirmation. They were hiding something. The black ink was as loud as a confession. The war had not begun with the certified letter 2 weeks ago. It had begun years before he even inherited this land. A generational grudge simmering beneath the placid surface of Lakeview Meadows. The first overt shot had been fired on June 28th, during what was supposed to be a routine final inspection. The late June sun was high and hot. Caleb stood on his newly installed zoysia lawn, a masterpiece of landscape architecture that had cost a small fortune and months of planning. It was the final piece of a year-long renovation of his grandfather's old lake house. Across from him stood the triumvirate of the Architectural Control Committee, Karen Lawson, her ever-present Lieutenant Rob Hale, and a nervous-looking man named George. Karen, the HOA president and self-appointed arbiter of taste, held a clipboard like a scepter. She wasn't looking at the new stone retaining wall, the tasteful native plantings, or the perfectly integrated irrigation system. Her eyes were fixed on the new mailbox. "The finish. Caleb," she said, her voice carrying across the lawn for the benefit of any neighbors who might be listening. "The approved application. Form B7 clearly specifies a brushed nickel finish for the mailbox and post." She tapped the mailbox with a perfectly manicured finger. This appears to be satin, nickel. They are, as I'm sure you're aware, technically different finishes. The reflectivity is entirely wrong for this elevation." Rob Hale, a burly handyman who served as Karen's muscle and enforcer, grunted in agreement. "Yeah, definitely satin. Got a real shine to it." Caleb felt the familiar heat rise in his chest. The instinct to argue the absurd, to point out that the difference was imperceptible to anyone but a metallurgist with a grudge. But he held his tongue. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Never let them see you sweat. Just show them the facts." He had been prepared for this. He knew Karen's methods. Her power wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the exhaustion and expense of fighting her interpretation of them. "You're right, Karen," Caleb said, his voice calm. "It's important to adhere to the approved plans." He walked to the new stone porch, opened a weatherproof document box installed next to the door, and retrieved a plastic-sleeved document. He walked back and handed it to her. It was the ACC's final approval form for the mailbox, signed 2 months prior by Karen herself. Attached to it was the manufacturer's spec sheet for the item, with the product number highlighted, and next to that was a small, metallic sample card, the exact finish that he had submitted with his application, also initialed KL, in her distinctive, looping script. "I had the vendor include the sample card with the shipment, just to be sure," Caleb said pleasantly. "As you can see from your own signature, the approved finish is indeed satin nickel, model 48B. The application must have had a clerical error. I'm just glad we caught it and you approved the correct one." He didn't say, "You're wrong." He didn't say, "You're a petty tyrant." He simply presented the undeniable, documented fact of her own approval. The public humiliation was quiet, but devastating. George, the other committee member, suddenly found the pattern on his shoes fascinating. Rob Hale's confident grunt died in his throat. Karen's smile became a thin, bloodless line. She stared at her own signature for a long moment, the gears of her mind audibly grinding. She had been outmaneuvered, her ambush foiled by simple, meticulous paperwork. She handed the document back, her knuckles white. "Very well," she said, her voice tight. "The mailbox is compliant. However, we will be monitoring the overall aesthetic of the lakeshore modifications closely, for the benefit of the entire community." Of course. It was a threat, cloaked in the language of governance. Caleb simply nodded. "I would expect nothing less." As they walked away, Karen's parting shot hung in the air. Community harmony depends on everyone respecting the established view corridors. Caleb, remember that. He remembered, and he knew the mailbox was just the opening salvo. The real war would be fought over the water. Back in his study, the room that had been his grandfather's sanctuary, Caleb spread the old documents across a massive oak desk. He was a freelance hydrologist. His world was one of maps, water tables, and the slow, inexorable march of geological time. He understood lines on a map better than most people understood the back of their own hand. He ran a finger over the centerpiece of the room, a framed, cloth-backed plat map of the property from 1946. The lines were clear, the calligraphic script a testament to an era of craftsmanship. The property line along the lake was not a vague suggestion. It was a series of meets and bounds tied to 2 permanent monuments, an iron axle buried near an ancient oak, and a granite post on the far side of the cove. Next to the map, he opened his grandfather's copy of the Lakeview Meadows Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. It was a thick, intimidating document, bound in a faded blue cover. His grandfather had treated it like a sacred text and a battle plan, filling its margins with spidery, handwritten notes. Caleb flipped to Article 8, the section on use restrictions, and there it was. Section 8.4.2, Preservation of Lakeside View Corridors. A paragraph of dense legalese about preventing obstructions that would materially impair the view of the lake from the common area. His grandfather had bracketed the entire section. In the margin, in faded blue ink, was a cryptic note. C. Miller Easement, 1988. This was never about our lot. The Miller Easement. The name sparked a memory. Old Mr. Henderson, Karen's father, had been the original developer of the lots adjacent to his grandfather's property. He'd tried to claim a piece of the Morgan shoreline back in the late 80s. A nasty dispute over this very issue. His grandfather, armed with his survey and a deep knowledge of property law, had fought him and won. Henderson, a man of considerable ego, had been publicly humiliated and forced to redraw his development plans. He sold his own home in the community shortly after. Karen had inherited her father's house and, it seemed, his grudge. This wasn't about a view. It was about settling a 40-year-old family score. Caleb leaned closer to the old plat map, his eyes scanning the detailed surveyor's notes in the margin. He'd looked at it 1,000 times. But now, he was looking with purpose. And there, almost lost in the faint, spidery script, was a reference he'd never noticed before. Ref Easement Deed, 8821B. The pieces were beginning to connect. His grandfather's note, the reference on the map, the timing of the dispute with Karen's father. Section 8.4.2 was the weapon Karen had chosen. But Caleb suspected its true purpose and application were buried in a county records office, hidden behind a wall of redacted documents and bureaucratic intransigence. On July 5th, the official declaration of war arrived. It wasn't a conversation or a polite request. It was a cold, formal document delivered by a mail carrier who looked vaguely apologetic as he handed over the clipboard for Caleb's signature. The green certified mail receipt felt like a summons. Inside the crisp envelope was a letter from Pristine Properties Management on behalf of the Lakeview Meadows HOA Board of Directors. The subject line was stark. Formal Notice of Violation, CCNR Article 8, Farger 8.4.2. The letter alleged that his new stone retaining wall and the westernmost portion of his dock constituted an unapproved encroachment into the Lakeside View Corridor, a designated common area easement. It cited the rule his grandfather had annotated. It demanded the immediate removal of the encroaching structures within 14 days. Failure to comply would result in the levying of fines, starting at $100 per day. Attached to the letter was a grainy, pixelated photograph, clearly taken from a drone, showing his dock and shoreline from an unflattering angle. A jagged red line had been crudely drawn on the photo, slicing across his property. Below it, a caption read, "Approximate location of view corridor boundary." Approximate. The word was an insult to his profession. There was nothing approximate about a boundary line. It was either there, or it wasn't. This was Karen's move. The mailbox had been a test of his resolve. This was the main assault. She had bypassed the customary courtesy notice, escalating directly to a formal violation. It was an aggressive, bullying tactic designed to intimidate and overwhelm. She was counting on him to panic, to call a lawyer, to get bogged down in a costly, protracted legal battle. She was wrong. He was the expert. He wouldn't just fight this. He would dismantle it. piece by documented piece. His first step wasn't to call a lawyer. It was to write the polite, formal email to Brenda at Pristine Properties, requesting the meeting minutes. And, when he walked out of that office with the redacted documents in his briefcase, he knew his second step was a call to the one man who knew this land as well as he did. The redacted minutes were more than an obstacle. They were a roadmap. The sheer volume of black ink told Caleb exactly where Karen's case was weakest. They were hiding the legislative intent of FOA 8.4.2 because the truth didn't support their position. The Miller easement was the key. He just had to find it. His next stop was the county records office, a cavernous, dusty building downtown that smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. He found the public access terminals and began his search for easement deed 8821B. The county's digital records were a tangled mess, but after an hour of navigating the archaic system, he found a scanned image of the document. The deed was between Henderson Development and a family named Miller, who had owned the adjacent, undeveloped parcel at the time. It granted a specific, narrow easement for scenic view purposes that only became active if the Millers decided to subdivide their land. The easement was designed to protect the lake views for the future homes in that subdivision. It had nothing to do with the existing common area trail, and it certainly had nothing to do with Caleb's property. He printed a certified copy. This was a powerful weapon. But it wasn't enough. He needed to prove that the board in 1988 knew this and that the adoption of FOA 8.4.2 was directly tied to this specific easement. The unredacted minutes were the only thing that could do that. He approached the main desk, where a woman with a formidable beehive hairdo and a nameplate that read Gloria presided over a kingdom of paper. She looked at him over her bifocals with an expression of profound skepticism. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she sincerely hoped the answer was no. "I hope so," Caleb said, laying the redacted minutes on the counter. "I'm trying to get an unredacted copy of these HOA minutes from 1988. I was told they were sealed due to attorney-client privilege." Gloria sniffed, picking up the papers as if they were contaminated. HOA business. It's always a mess. She squinted at the redactions. Attorney-client privilege is the excuse they use when they don't want you to see what they were really up to. If this was filed with the county as part of a covenant package, though, the original microfiche might still be in the archives. They didn't have fancy redaction software back then. They just used a marker on the copy they sent you. She looked from the papers to Caleb's face, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "Why do you want it so bad?" "Because I believe a rule is being misapplied to seize a portion of my private property," Caleb said simply. A slow smile spread across Gloria's face. "Oh, I hate when they do that." She stamped a form with satisfying force. "Give me an hour. If it's in the archives, I'll find it. I love a good treasure hunt, especially when it makes a bunch of HOA lawyers nervous." Gloria was his unsung hero, his procedural spirit guide, while she hunted in the dusty archives. Caleb made his next call. Evan Pike's old Ford pickup rattled down Caleb's driveway, carrying the best surveyor in the county and a small arsenal of high-tech equipment. Evan, with his sun-weathered face and eyes that could spot a survey monument from 100 yards, was a living link to Caleb's grandfather and the property's history. "Let me see the letter," he grunted, foregoing any pleasantries. He read the violation notice, his expression souring. He looked at the crudely drawn red line on the drone photo and snorted in disgust. Amateurs. A boundary line is a sacred thing. Caleb. It's the difference between order and chaos. This is graffiti. They walked the property together. Evan pointed out the old monuments, the iron axle, now covered in a thin layer of moss. And the granite post. He set up his total station, a robotic transit that measured distances and angles with laser precision. He confirmed the location of the original monuments, tying them into the state's GPS grid. They were exactly where the 1946 plat map said they should be. "The line is the line," Evans said, patting the transit, solid as a rock. Then Caleb showed him the spot. Near the new retaining wall, about 15 feet inside his property line, was a piece of rebar hammered into the ground, topped with a bright orange plastic cap. It looked official to the untrained eye. Evan knelt, examining it with a professional's contempt. Freshly driven, soils still disturbed. The cap is a generic, no license number. State law requires a licensed surveyor's number on any permanent monument cap. He stood and kicked it lightly with his boot. It wobbled. It's a fraud, a prop. They planted it to create the illusion of a boundary. The call from Nate, Caleb's best friend and a former Marine who ran a high-end security consulting firm, came while Evan was packing up. "I'm on my way," Nate said after Caleb explained the situation. "Don't do anything until I get there. This isn't a land dispute anymore. This is an operation." Nate arrived with a case of equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. He wasn't just thinking about defense. He was thinking about intelligence gathering. "They'll be back," Nate said, scanning the property with a practiced eye. "They planted their fake marker. Now they have to legitimize it. They'll send someone to take photos of it, maybe run a string from it. They're building a fraudulent paper trail, and we're going to catch them in the act." That evening, under the cover of dusk, they installed 3 discrete, motion-activated night vision cameras. One was focused on the fake rebar pin, another on the access trail from the common area, and a third gave a wide view of the retaining wall and dock. They were virtually invisible, their feeds routed directly to Caleb's phone and computer. Caleb's final call was to a lawyer who specialized in property law, a sharp, no-nonsense woman his firm sometimes consulted. He laid out the entire story, the history, the violation, the redacted minutes, Evan's findings, the fake pin. Her advice was simple and clear. Document everything. Do not engage with them directly. Let them continue to break the law. You have a perfect case for a civil suit, but what you're describing is also criminal, vandalism, attempting to file a fraudulent document. This is serious. The more rope they take, the more securely they'll hang themselves. Attend the hearing. Present your facts calmly. Let them rule against you. Their flawed decision will become Exhibit A. The trap was set. The evidence was being gathered. Now, they just had to wait for the quarry to walk into it. The alert came at 2:17 a.m. on July 28th. A soft chime from Caleb's phone on his nightstand. He was instantly awake. The motion sensor on camera 2, the one aimed at the retaining wall, had been triggered. He tapped the notification. The live feed filled his screen. A world of ghostly green and white. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, was moving stealthily along the base of his new stone wall. It was Rob Hale. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. A slow, heavy beat. He watched, holding his breath. Hale wasn't just inspecting the wall. In his hand was a heavy-duty pry bar. He glanced around nervously, then wedged the tip of the bar between 2 of the large, fitted stones in the wall. He threw his weight against it. The stone shifted with a silent groan. He worked his way down the wall, loosening several more stones, pulling away the landscape fabric behind them, and kicking dirt and gravel down toward the water. He was deliberately creating damage, manufacturing the appearance of instability and erosion. He was fabricating evidence to support Karen's claim that the shoreline was shifting. This was it, the moment the conflict escalated from a civil procedural dispute into undeniable criminal activity, vandalism, destruction of property. It was all being recorded in crystal clear, high-definition video, time-stamped and undeniable. Caleb saved the clip, his hands steady despite the surge of adrenaline. He sent a text to Nate. "We got him. Red-handed." The response was immediate. "Don't engage. Let him finish. The more he does, the better for us. We have him now." Caleb watched for another 10 minutes as hail methodically damaged the wall his grandfather had dreamed of, and he had spent a small fortune to build. Every scrape of the pry bar, every stone he dislodged, was another nail in Karen Lawson's coffin. This wasn't just about a view anymore. It was about a calculated criminal conspiracy. And he had the proof. The hearing on August 5th was a masterclass in procedural theater. It was held in the same sterile conference room at the Pristine Properties office. But this time, the full board was present. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by her two loyalists and the one perpetually nervous member. George, Brenda, the manager, was there to take minutes. It was a kangaroo court. Karen acted as prosecutor, judge, and jury. Caleb presented his case with calm, deliberate precision. He laid the certified plat map on the table. He presented Evan Pike's new survey, which confirmed the original map down to the centimeter. He explained the legal concept of fixed boundaries versus a meandering high water mark. Karen waved it all away. "The board appreciates your historical documents." Caleb, however, the association's own experts have determined that the view corridor is a community easement that has been impacted by your unapproved construction. "Who are these experts?" Caleb asked. "May I see their report?" "That information is privileged," Karen said smoothly. "It's part of the board's work product." "Then, let's talk about the condition of the property," Caleb said. Shifting gears, he placed his phone on the table. "I have time-stamped video footage from the night of July 28th that I believe is highly relevant to this matter. It shows an agent of the HOA deliberately damaging the very retaining wall you are citing for erosion." A flicker of panic crossed Karen's eyes before being replaced by a mask of cold authority. "Mr. Morgan, this hearing is to address your violation of FR 8.4.2. We are not here to review your home movies. The video is outside the scope of this hearing and is therefore inadmissible." George shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Karen, maybe we should just look at it." "The matter is not up for debate." "George," Karen snapped. She turned back to Caleb. "Do you have any further evidence that pertains, specifically, to the violation as stated in the notice?" Caleb knew he was beaten, not on the facts, but by the process. They had constructed a closed loop where only their evidence was permissible. He had walked into her courtroom, and she controlled all the rules. "No," he said, collecting his papers. "I have nothing further." The board voted, as expected, 3-1 to find him in violation. George was the lone dissenter. Karen announced the decision with grim satisfaction. "You will receive a formal letter outlining the board's decision and the associated fines. Failure to remit payment and cure the violation will result in the association placing a lien on your property." The letter arrived 3 days later. The fine was $100 per day, retroactive to the date of the notice. The total was already over $3,000. The threat was no longer just about a piece of land. It was about his financial stability, his credit, and, ultimately, the potential foreclosure and loss of his grandfather's home. The stakes had been raised to the highest possible level. But Karen had made a critical error. She thought the hearing was the end of the fight. For Caleb, It was just the final piece of evidence he needed to prove her entire process was a corrupt sham. The annual meeting was in 1 week. That wouldn't be her courtroom. It would be his. The Lakeview Meadows annual homeowners meeting on August 15th was held in the community clubhouse, a stuffy, beige room filled with about 60 residents. Most looked bored, resigned to another tedious evening of budget reports and committee updates. At the front of the room, Karen Lawson and the board sat at a long table, basking in the fluorescent glow of their authority. Behind them, a large projection screen displayed the meeting's agenda. A digital clock in the corner of the screen was counting down the time allotted for each agenda item. Item number 7 was Homeowner Open Forum. 5 minutes per household. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, a sweet-natured widow who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, went before Caleb. She spoke in a quavering voice about a violation notice she'd received for a small bird bath in her garden. She was on a fixed income, and the threat of a $25 per day fine terrified her. Karen's response was a chilling display of condescending power. "Margaret," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "the rules on lawn ornaments are quite clear and apply to everyone equally. We cannot make exceptions. It's for the good of the entire community and to protect property values." Mrs. Gable retreated to her seat, looking crushed. Then, it was Caleb's turn. "Next up, we have Caleb Morgan," Karen announced, a smirk playing on her lips. Caleb walked to the podium and connected his laptop to the projector. The timer on the screen reset. 5, whoa. The countdown began. "Good evening," Caleb began, his voice amplified by the microphone. Calm and clear. "I'm here tonight not to argue, but to present a sequence of documented facts regarding the board's recent actions against my property." A new image filled the screen. On the left was the grainy drone photo from his violation notice, with Karen's crude red line. On the right was a crystal-clear, surveyor-stamped aerial map. "This is the boundary the board claims in their notice," he said, pointing to the left. "And this is the legal, recorded boundary of my property, confirmed by a licensed surveyor last month." The difference was stark and undeniable. He clicked to the next slide. It was a photo of Evan Pike's new survey report, the seal and signature prominently displayed. "This is the work of a professional, not a guess from a hobby drone." The next slide showed the heavily redacted minutes he'd received from Pristine Properties. "When I asked for the history of the rule, I allegedly violated. Farger 8.4.2. This is what the board provided, citing attorney-client privilege." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He clicked again. The next slide showed the same page, but unredacted. A bold yellow highlight covered a key sentence. "And this is the original document, which I obtained from the county archives." I'd like to read the crucial sentence from the board's own discussion in 1988. "It is resolved that this view corridor easement shall apply specifically to the undeveloped Miller parcel, contingent upon its future subdivision, to protect the viewshed for those future lots." He clicked to a map of the county. "My property is here," he said, a red arrow pointing to his lot. "The Miller parcel, which was developed in 1995, is over here." A blue arrow pointed to an entirely different subdivision on the other side of the cove. Section 8.4.2, the entire basis for the board's actions, has never ever applied to my property. This isn't a misinterpretation of a rule. It is the knowing application of an irrelevant one. The room was now silent, hanging on his every word. Karen was white-knuckled, gripping her pen. "Your time is nearly up, Mr. Morgan," Karen interjected, her voice sharp. A man in the back shouted, "Let him speak." A chorus of agreement followed. Caleb didn't acknowledge her. He clicked to the next slide. Video. The silent, ghostly green footage filled the screen. The entire room watched Rob Hale, the HOA's own handyman, using a pry bar to tear apart Caleb's new retaining wall in the dead of night. There were audible gasps. The video ended. The room was in shock. Karen, desperate, tried to deflect. This is an outrage. This has nothing to do with the valid violations we are trying to enforce. What about Mrs. Gable's non-compliant birdbath? The rules must be followed. She was trying to change the subject, to use the frail old woman as a shield. This was Caleb's moment of choice. He had 60 seconds left. His final slide was the newspaper clipping that would expose Karen's personal 40-year-old grudge. He could land the killing blow. Or he looked toward Mrs. Gable. Karen is right. The rules should be followed. He clicked to a new slide, showing a picture of Mrs. Gable's birdbath with a tape measure next to it. ACC Guideline 4.7b, which I looked up this afternoon, states that minor water features under 24 inches in height are permitted without prior approval. As you can see, Mrs. Gable's birdbath is 22 inches tall. It is, and always has been, fully compliant. He looked directly at Karen. You're not enforcing rules. You're harassing a vulnerable resident on a fixed income. And you're doing it with our money. The homeowners erupted. The tide had not just turned. It was a tsunami. With seconds to spare, Caleb clicked to his final slide. It was a scanned image of a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1989. The headline read, Henderson Development Proposal Defeated. Morgan Property Line Upheld in Court. The article detailed his grandfather's victory over Karen's father. He turned from the screen and looked at Karen Lawson, his voice dropping, but carrying across the suddenly silent room. This was never about a view corridor or a birdbath. It was about a 40-year-old grudge you inherited from your father. And you used this community's resources to pursue a personal vendetta. The timer flashed red. Time's up. The room exploded into chaos. The pandemonium was immediate. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. The board members, except for Karen, looked shell-shocked, as if they had just woken up in the middle of a train wreck they had helped cause. A man in a crisp suit, a retired accountant Caleb recognized from down the street, stood on a chair to be heard over the din. I make a motion from the floor, he yelled. I move for an immediate, independent, third-party forensic audit of this board's financials and all legal expenditures for the past 5 years. Second, a woman shouted from the back. Karen, her face a pale mask of fury, banged her gavel. This is out of order. There is no motion on the floor. But she had lost control. The room was no longer hers. Call the vote, someone yelled. The motion passed by a deafening roar of AYE. Before the noise could die down, another homeowner stood. I move for the immediate suspension of the entire board, pending the results of that audit, and a full investigation into this corruption. As the motion was seconded, a man in the corner who had been silent all evening stood up. He was the representative from Pristine Properties Management. Seeing the tidal wave of homeowner rage and the mountain of potential liability Caleb had just revealed, he made a swift corporate decision to abandon ship. Pristine Properties Management, he announced in a loud, clear voice, takes these allegations with the utmost seriousness. We will cooperate fully with the independent auditor and any legal investigations that may arise from the evidence presented here tonight. Our priority is, and always will be, the transparent and lawful governance of the communities we serve. It was over. The management company had publicly turned on the board. The homeowners were in open revolt. Karen Lawson sat alone at the long table, the gavel useless in her hand, her petty empire crumbling around her in a beige, windowless room. The months that followed were a quiet, methodical cleansing. The audit revealed a pattern of mismanagement and vindictive enforcement actions orchestrated by Karen. The board was forced to resign in disgrace. A special election was held, and a new slate of directors, including the accountant who had called for the audit, was swept into office on a platform of transparency. One of their first acts was to formally rescind the violation notice against Caleb, void the fines, and expunge the entire matter from his record. They issued a formal, written apology to both him and Mrs. Gable, the association's insurance carrier, facing a massive lawsuit, settled with Caleb out of court, covering all of his legal fees and the cost to repair the retaining wall. Karen and her husband put their house up for sale. It sold quickly, at a loss. They were gone within 2 months, vanishing from the community as if they had never been there. The personal war that had spanned 2 generations was finally, definitively over. 6 months after the climactic meeting, Caleb found himself in an unfamiliar position, sitting at the ACC's table, not as an applicant, but as its newest member, appointed by the new board. They wanted his meticulous, principled approach to help restore faith in the system. At his first meeting, he presented a proposal. The audit had uncovered a significant surplus in the reserve funds, money that had been hoarded by the previous board. For years, Caleb said to the committee, the lakefront has been a source of division in our community, a symbol of what's private and what's not. I propose we change that. He unrolled a plan to use a portion of the surplus funds to build a small, beautifully designed kayak and paddleboard launch on an undisputed, underutilized strip of HOA common area property. It would have storage racks, a gentle slope to the water, and a bench for watching the sunset. It would be a shared resource, an asset for everyone, built not on a fraudulent claim, but on a genuine act of community improvement. The proposal was met with unanimous, enthusiastic approval. On a warm spring afternoon the following year, Caleb stood on the new community dock, watching a family laugh as they helped their young daughter into a small, brightly colored kayak. The water of the lake, his lake, sparkled in the sun. The ugly fight had left scars, but from them, something better had grown. He had not only defended his line in the sand, he had helped erase the lines that had divided his neighbors. His grandfather had taught him to protect what was beautiful. He finally understood that the most beautiful thing of all wasn't the land or the water, but the quiet harmony of a community at peace.